the complete soul of one person moved from one body to another, while at the same time believing that their soul could be communicated with in the afterlife. So to me, it seems a more consistent view, one that would have been more common in a lot of indigenous animistic cultures, would have been the idea that impressions of an ancestor, more particularly, though it could have been someone outside of your tribe or outside of your community or from a radically different nation state or whatever the case may be, but it likely would have been an impression. Uh, I've often used as a sort of symbolism for this the idea that the essential element of the soul, the sort of matter of the soul, as it were, is like silly putty, and it picks up all these different influences from different people and different lifetimes, different elements within the world. And speaking more metaphysically, spiritually, not in any sort of environmental, psychological, or physiological way. And I think that's probably one of the more consistent ways that you could look at reincarnation, is also being consistent with views of ancestor worship and making offerings to the dead and funerary rites.
Yeah, as I see it, I don't think well, as I see it, what I see as a soul, the way I picture it in my mind, I think that there may be a possibility that it does not. Well, like you said, there's like husks, there's things that are taken out and such. I can imagine that not staying whole and having parts of it return to the living, parts of it stay with the non-living longer. I could see other parts of other souls fusing to new souls. I mean, I could see any of that, and I've imagined some of that kind of fits better with the structure of my other beliefs. It would make more sense from what I've observed if that is true. But it seems anyone who believes in a soul will not accept the idea that it may be, you may be able to mold it like that. That doesn't just stay whole and it's not eternal and perfect in its original form.
Well, definitely as is conceived in modern thinking, and a lot of world religions have very particularly set views on how the soul is configured, and that's actually what I wanted to mention a little bit earlier is the concept of reincarnation and transmigration are very, very set. In Hinduism, it's more transmigration. It's the literal migration of one soul into another human body, or even into less than human. But in Buddhism, it's much more of a segmented kind of concept. It wouldn't have been inconsistent for the idea of the emotions of a person to reincarnate into a different being, while the mind into another person, and the soul into another being, another person in another person's lifetime. I don't have the specific names or doctrines for that, but it's definitely something I've encountered before. And if you read up on the subject, a lot of times reincarnation is used more specifically to describe Buddhism, and transmigration is more to describe Hinduism, because of their conception of the ego and ultimately their conception of the soul being rather different.
And I also think it's important that when I think of these things and how we describe places that a soul could go to and such, I think that the truth of those, if they do exist, is so far alien to what we're used to that it's going to be it's going to be something not entirely different, but that what we're using is only an analogy, because that type of realm would be so much different that that's the only way we can speak of it. And it is so hard to find words for that, because just by definition, the languages we've developed are to explain our kind of reality. So to explain anything else is quite the trial.
Yes, and that's definitely an idea echoed in a lot of ancient beliefs and a lot of ancient mythologies, hence their diversity.
But yeah, I think that's all I had on that, was just those 2 points. And I do find it really important that they're brought up, because a lot of people take words far too literal. because we're using what we have to explain these thoughts in our head, and sometimes the words are just not there.
Definitely.
Hi, Jonathan.
Good evening. Good to see you guys.
Is he a little loud for anyone else?
I'm sorry?
Oh, no, that's about right. Like, when you first started talking, you seemed a little loud, but I just turned my headphones down just a tad.
Okay.
I'm thinking Kevin's still going to be loud enough, so I should be good.
Yeah, I mean, let me see if I can work with the microphone gain.
Yeah. You are right on my head, so it's only about that much distance from my ear.
If I talk at a distance, does that help?
Yeah, there. That's like perfect. It's like when your face is right up to it. It's a little loud for me.
Okay.
For me personally.
That's So you guys are talking about souls?
Yeah, afterlife mostly. Yeah. So
Um,
that's definitely a part of it.
there's this book that I have that I've never read, but purchased at the request of somebody. Said it was probably the best argument for souls from an Aristotelian perspective. It's called In Defense of the Soul, What It Means to Be Human by Rick Machuga, professor of philosophy at Butte College in Roseville, California. Um, Never read it. We'll see. Apparently he tries to make an Aristotelian argument for the soul. I'll get to it eventually. I personally have always had trouble with the idea of souls. Um, this idea of disembodied spiritual beings that constitute the essence of a human. I just I just have a hard time with it. Um, Not because I'm certainly not a materialist, but um, I just don't. I I feel like even in the Bible, soul is referring to something that is extraordinarily hard to grasp because it's so interlinked with the mind um, and the emotion. That whole logos, pathos sort of thing. You don't really know where one begins and the other ends. And the fact that the resurrection in Christianity is not um, a resurrection of souls, but of actual physical bodies. Um, I as a Christian, I have a hard time even putting a category together for souls. I know that isn't true of many Christians through the centuries, but that's just me.
That's what I was going to say. I was going to I've never heard a Christian say it that way. Quite to the contrary, they're very
Our whole
free to say that they completely believe in souls.
Yeah, our whole understanding of the afterlife in Christianity comes from Jesus Christ. It comes from his resurrection, and so when Jesus comes back and he's interacting with people, we don't we see him in a physical body. It is like an advanced physical body. I mean, he's able to walk through walls and do things that normal human beings can't do. So it's obviously a different type of body, but Thomas is the one he engages with, and Thomas doesn't believe him at all. And Jesus beckons Thomas to feel his hands. and feel the wounds on his hands. And so Thomas feels the wounds, and then he believes, oh my gosh, this is the risen Christ. Um, and so, and the apostles talk about people who fall asleep in the Lord and who are going to be come to life on the last day. They're going to rise on the last day. The tombs will be opened, as and even in Christian burial rites, for the longest time, people felt that you needed to bury a body intact, so that on the last day, when you arose, your body would still be there. There was like a moratorium against burning bodies or cremation. I think that that's a short-sighted view, that your physical body would necessarily have to have a one-to-one relationship with your new body. But to me, it's the resurrection life will be just a new body altogether. I mean, people grow up with deformities, they grow up with heart problems, they grow up with all sorts of different impediments. That's just part of this fallen world, and we're promised a new world with a new body, and that body will be perfect as it should have been. But because of this fallen world, we had clubfoot, or we're blind in one eye, or what have you. Yeah, but much to the chagrin to others, I don't believe in souls. I don't believe in soul mates. And even passages in the Bible that refer to souls, I feel, is more referring to the mind, body, emotion, thing.
Okay. A very interesting take, at least for me. Different than anything I've heard before. And I personally I'm pretty close to a materialist, but not quite, so not at all, I guess. That's what a materialist would tell me. Well, most of them. You got to be 100% or none at all.
Yeah, I mean, the only stumbling block for me with souls is the fact that I have met people and dealt with folks who have had some sort of supernatural activity in their life that was negative. So a ghost, for example, or some sort of haunting. I have had stories relate to me where, first person, this person goes and they work in a food service industry, and they're working in this area of the nursing home that used to be the crazy house, and lo and behold, they're getting their food carts ready, and Rob Zombie starts playing on the radio. And apparently this angered the spirits, because the next thing, all of the food carts that they have lined up are just smashed against the wall with nobody doing it, and just thrown, and everything is just thrown everywhere. And it's freaked the hell out of everybody who was working, but it happened. So that's a stumbling block for me, because I don't really. It's hard for me to process that. I've talked to my Christian friends. I'm like, well, that's demonic activity. I'm like, well, that's just a blanket statement. You don't really know. I don't really know, and so you blame the demons. I don't know what it is. I had a friend growing up who had a best friend who had all these characteristics of a well, he was an imaginary friend. And this imaginary friend had all the characteristics of a kid who had died in that house that he had moved into, about 70 years ago, earlier. So it's just, you know, I can't deny that there's spiritual activity out there, that there is some sort of spiritual realm that exists, but I'm not willing to build concrete beliefs around it, let alone a concrete theology uh, around it. Um, you know, and even when I study the Bible, it sort of says the spiritual realm is there, um, but don't engage in it. Don't contact mediums. Don't contact the dead. We're not really told why. We're just told don't do it. Um, it sort of implies that it can be done. Um, and after experiencing what I have experienced, I would say that, yeah, I would believe that it can be done. But I'm not going to mess with it, and I advise anyone else that I know to, why would you want to invite that into your life? Why don't you just be happy and drink good beer or something like that?
Well, there is something to be said about curiosity. It's a very
Uh,
natural and very human thing.
yeah, yeah, it's
You asked why, that's my best answer for you.
huh?
You asked why, and that's my best answer I got for you.
All right. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that curiosity, but I do not want to partake in it. I mean, let's just, you know, I even have, I have a problem even watching paranormal TV shows or movies. And it depends on how. If it's a really ridiculous paranormal thing like Sleepy Hollow on Fox, I have no problem with that because it's so ridiculous. It's not even funny. But when it like gets to a point where it's like, oh my gosh, this is sort of creepily, real. It just hits way too close to home to me, and
Oh yeah.
I watch it. I
Is
will
it
not.
like the difference between like pure fantasy and like a more magical realism for you?
Yeah, yeah. I suppose you could describe it that way.
Anyone got anything else that's piqued their interest as of lately?
Yeah, I mean, as of lately, I've been thinking about some issues within Christianity, but nothing that I don't know if the group can hold on to or not. I guess a really good question to be debate is the effectiveness of or the goodness of forcing people to take a break on Sundays just to not work. Um, I think it's a social problem that we have families where both parents are working 7 days a week and not caring for their children because our society sort of endorses working on Sunday as something that's good. Um, and somebody was talking to me is the actual Old Testament verse talks about not only uh, following God and being God's people on Sunday, but also instituting the Sabbath for the sojourner within your gates, which would generally refer to everybody else, even if you don't believe in Christianity. You ought to not work on Sunday, or you don't believe in Judaism, I guess, Old Testament. It's interesting to see what you guys think about that. I think that it's extraordinarily important for people to have a day off during the week. I think it's extraordinarily healthy for society as well.
Yeah, for me, I'm not so hooked on what day, but yeah, it's good to have a day off during the week. I think another thing is how many hours you work each day. Um, I was talking in some other hangouts over the weekend with people from Europe where they have much shorter work weeks. and they were speaking about the benefits of that, and they were saying how they're still getting their ends to meet, and some of them seem to be doing similar work and doing better. It really depends on the economy of that said country, though, because depending on what country I was talking to, some of them aren't pulling that off but trying. But yeah, that's a little of a side note. The thing is I think striking a balance between work and leisure is very important, and I definitely would say that the United States is not finding that balance very well.
Yeah, I would agree.
Speaking historically, in non-Christian beliefs, and I can speak more obviously within my tradition, ancient Greece. I mean, you would have had times throughout every month where you weren't working. And there are sacred days throughout every month. There are many different festivals in every lunar cycle, some of which were a few days long, others of which were multiple weeks long. So, I mean, the idea of having a sort of culturally mandated rest would have actually been fairly common um, in many different cultures. And I mean, as it stands, our culture is, at the very least, influenced by Christianity, if not based largely on it. And having, if not Saturday and Sunday, at least Sunday, as at least an informal day of rest, I think is a good idea. And doesn't necessarily have to have religious significance, but can definitely have familial uh, meaning. And that is to say that it could be a time for families. And I remember mentioning this a few times before. In Japan, it's actually a fairly common thing as a sort of cultural mandate that, despite being a very work-oriented culture, often to their discredit, um, it's sort of culturally mandated that if you wake up in the morning, you're living with your family, that you spend time to sit down to breakfast with your father, specifically, most especially with your father, as well as your mother. But it sort of ties into a lot of East Asian concepts of filial piety in particular. But um, there's a bit of that there for its own purpose because there needs to be a time for that sort of quiescence, and that's an element that's very, very important in that culture, not just in more modern forms of Christianity in the East, but also in Buddhism and the much earlier Shintoism, which echoes what I was saying about Greek religion. So it's difficult because there's a disconnect and we live in a modern culture. But I do think to a certain extent that if it's not something that's culturally mandated, it's to the discretion of individuals and particularly families to take that time out, even if they're not making as much money as perhaps they'd like to, because working yourself to the end of the, that is to say, burning the candle at both ends is never good.
Good. I'm glad you hear that. Uh, I've been talking about this with a few friends, and they sort of agreed. Like, there's just almost this lamentation at the blue laws. At least, there were legal benefits in at least Pennsylvania and Maryland that sort of said, hey, if you don't work in a hot police emergency services worker, there's no reason why you should be working on this day. This day is reserved for family. And they didn't mandate any church that you had to go to. They just mandated that, hey, if you're in manufacturing, or if you service something family, you should be doing stuff. And I thought that was a great right thing. Promotion, and I'm not going to say, I'm not going to say that the government's doing such things, but at least definitely see that as doing the benefit as opposed to something that was bad.
Well, I know that a lot of businesses, whether or not it's Sunday, will often pick one day out of the week. It's usually the
Oh yeah.
uh, most advantageous for them. I mean, known a lot of I've known a lot of restaurants that do that. They'll pick like Monday or Wednesday to have a day off. Oftentimes, it will dovetail with when they have their shipments, or sometimes in contrast to when they have their shipments, depending on what kind of business it is. With Yeah, Monday seems to be a really big one with restaurants. Most of the Asian restaurants that I've known, like big Chinese and Thai, Japanese restaurants, they close on Mondays. Some of the like Italian restaurants, German delis, a lot of those old school, more European focused ones, they usually pick Sunday because it's more of that, once again, that sort of cultural mandate, and it's sort of expected to begin with. But most businesses will have that. I think if businesses can have that, why can't families and individuals? That's why we have sick days and vacation days.
Yeah.
At least that's why we're supposed to have it in
Yeah.
theory.
Exactly.
I think another thing that was discussed when I was discussing work is how a lot of people, if you have the opportunity for vacation time, but if you take it, once you come back, all the work that you had to do while you were gone is still there. So it just means you got more to do and you have less time to do it. And we there needs to be found a way to where you can take a vacation and you're actually getting away from something, not just postponing it. Because I find that it's far from relaxing for me when I come back to that situation.
Yeah. I'm definitely with you there. I think companies, ought to have some sort of support structure there. I've been very fortunate in mine, so I haven't really had to have any of, work that I've had to do when I came back. Um, but yeah, that is, it's important. I think it's always so important, in some industries, like the industry I'm in, banking, you have to, there's like mandated vacation. Because of the amount of fraud in the industry, and financial crime. The number one way that financial crimes are revealed is actually people who never take a vacation, and then they decide to take one, and their web of lies falls apart. Um, and so, and even now, I think the federal government mandates protected persons. So executives, people who have a lot of power in the industry, are actually required to take at least 2 consecutive weeks of vacation, um, which, I wish everybody had that opportunity. Mandated paid vacation is pretty nice.
Well, I do have paid vacations, but it's practically impossible to actually take it.
Well, there's this unhealthy part of the culture that says, if you take a vacation, you're a lazy person. You shouldn't be taking advantage of your vacation because you're not contributing. Then you're not producing. You're not, whatever. And some office cultures are like that, where they treat, or even blue collar work, they treat you like you're, a piece of junk for taking your vacation
Right.
time. That is evil.
I at least get paid out when it goes above a certain threshold, so yeah, it's like having an extra bonus, I suppose. And I'm saying all this while I'm at home with a back injury. So yeah, I'm not producing today, and there's no way I could have. But Hopefully tomorrow. We'll see. So we have one other person that was going to join us that's having trouble. Okay. You know, one of these times I need to come prepared and actually have something to talk about.
Yeah, don't worry about it.
Yeah. It's that, you know, that need to produce stuck in my brain. I got to contribute.
So
Yeah.
I was talking to Abern earlier about this. There was a news story that came up earlier on my feed, and it was about somebody in the Texas, no, not Texas, it was Tennessee state legislature, and she was trying to get a bill passed where she'd be changing social studies curriculum or changing the social studies standards of curriculum so that um, religious studies wouldn't be included in earlier education until the 10th grade. So I'm not entirely sure what that would entail, and most of the articles I've read on the subject haven't really given me a lot of clarity on that. But it seems to suggest that discussions wouldn't go onto the subject of religion itself and what it teaches until the 10th grade in schools, or at least in Tennessee where this bill would be passed. Welcome, James.
Yeah, I'm looking at an article here from the Knoxville News Sentinel, I guess the local news service in Tennessee, and they're saying that it's a move to stop Islamic influence in public schools.
And those are the people who are getting really offended is Muslims. They've actually voiced concern about the bill as being bigoted towards Islam specifically.
10th, 11th, 12th. Well, I mean, I'm trying to think back to my own education. You know, you were not given the opportunity to learn about world religions until, actually, I think it was 10th grade. Um, yeah, because that was when I took world religions, and I took Renaissance and Reformation, and I took mythology, um, and all those other classes. Um, I mean, it does require a higher level of thinking in order to even get to that point where you can discuss those ideas with any leeway. Um, but
I had a very similar experience, but what it seems to almost be uh, with regards to this particular bill is it's in a region where it wouldn't necessarily be surprising that more religious instruction would be given even in public schools. It's a very conservative area, and it almost seems
mhm.
like I described it to Abern earlier as almost like taking your ball and going home. That's actually the term he used for it. So it's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
there are some religious conservatives in those areas who would want more Christian influenced things to be included in general education, but for fear that other things would also have to be included, we'll just throw the baby out with the bathwater and just
Yeah,
prevent anything from being discussed.
that's the same idea among the conservatives who want to throw out government marriage certificates. They're like, well, we lost the battle for gay marriage, and so now let's just throw out marriage certificates altogether. The yeah, I
If I can't have it, no one can. That kind of mentality.
yeah, that's exactly what it is. Historically speaking, religion was always taught in public schools from a young age. You learned your ABCs through sing-song stories about Adam and Eve, and the New England Primer. If you're looking for a primary source of early American school system, I mean, you could look at that. You could look at quotes from the 1800s, where even the American, what is it called? The there's an association, the American Association of Educators, or something like that, was saying, the time that the Bible is no longer taught in schools will be a terrible, the schools will be lost. And then the 50s and the 60s, the Bible ceases to be taught in public schools, and now with the decline of church history and theology being taught in public schools as they were all replaced with theology was replaced with religion, and church history with world religions. And I'm sort of the opinion that this is a public school, and you have decided via democracy to make the public schools in a position where religion is taught the way it is today. You have to drink. That's what you signed up for. And unfortunately, I think that if you want to raise your kids in a context where they're able to learn about Islam and world religions on your terms, you're going to have to send them to a private school. You're going to have to homeschool them. You're going to have to do something, or you're going to have to give them extracurricular classes after their regular school. One of the three. And I think that's it's a good question. I don't think people should feel threatened by world religions, and I think that the reason that they do feel threatened is, that Islam, unlike other world religions, has this component in it where, the ideology, there is no separation of church and state. Let's put it that way. That's the simplest way to put it. And so they're afraid of that. Those ideas will infiltrate the schools and infiltrate, the minds of people, and eventually infiltrate the courts, and the whole society will collapse. Worst case scenario kind of thing. I mean, I never felt learning about Islam. I actually found out, watching we grew up watching the PBS documentary on Islam and a few other, things, and I always felt, if you want to make a case for a militaristic religion, you found it right there. I actually found that most of my public school education that surrounded, the history of Islam, and even in a college, put a very rotten taste in my mouth. The more I sort of learned about it, the more it sort of made me not like it. The only people I never really had any beef with was the Sufis. I felt that they seemed to be the most honest of people who were following Islam, and they were the ones who were getting slaughtered by the conservative Islamists. So Frank, unfortunately, he wouldn't have had a very good time in the founding days of Islam. It just wasn't going to happen for him.
No, I tend to agree with you. A lot of modern Islam is poised to be oppositional, and a lot of religious extremism is being done through Islam. That being said, they're not the only ones that are infringing on the rights of others. If you look at Christianity in Africa, India, and China, um, some of that has been there for quite some time, but the ways in which they're interacting with local religions is less than stellar, let's say.
In what way? I mean, the church in China, I mean, you've got the state church, that's the only authorized church, and then you've got this underground church movement. I mean, the state church has actually burned a lot of these more evangelical churches to the ground. Not the state church, but the country, the governing party. Christianity's been, persecuted in China. It's not been under the status of power. The only time it was during was actually not by its own power, but the power of Germany and other countries that sort of came in and made their own sphere of influence.
Christianity has went out of its way to go into areas where it's unwelcome to see converts. Very few other religions have done that, save for Islam.
Well, Islam was spread by much the same way Christianity was spread. I mean, it was missionizing merchants and traders. I mean, I remember studying Islam, the spread of Islam into Indonesia, for example, and into India. I mean, it was all about trade routes and these Arab traders that were going different places and bringing these ideas with them. Christianity spreads across the Mediterranean much in the same way.
And that's not to say that all examples of conversion were negative in both Christianity and Islam, but there definitely is considerable conflict that was brought about through religious conversion in and of itself, through both religions. Some of that has been recognized, quite a bit actually has been recognized in modern times. But sometimes it's kind of shoe on the other foot. You have Christians looking at what Islam is doing now and completely ignoring what they've done in the past. And you have Muslims who are doing very much the same sort of thing, talking about, that they are being religiously discriminated against, and yet they are perpetrating quite a bit of religious persecution on Christians in nations where they have power. Everyone has their part to play, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not a polite conversation about ideas in the world. It's a war of ideas. Everybody thinks that they have the right one, and it's sometimes a miracle that civil society is able to exist at all. Areas of extreme religious conflict are only kept peaceful by extraordinarily strong regimes, like Tito in Yugoslavia, or Saddam Hussein in Iraq. We saw what happened when those dictators were overthrown or lost power, and it was not pretty for anyone. One of the things that I really get upset about, I've sort of seen an increase of on the internet, is with ISIS sort of rampaging on and on unchecked. Really, apart from aerial strikes that tend to kill more civilians than they do ISIS militants. They have been posting pictures of crusaders, and putting messages on there saying ISIS is just they haven't run into the right group of Christians yet, and I found that to be probably the most distasteful post I've seen. recently, just because one, it's antithetical to the gospel and what we're called to do in times of conflict. Um, and two, it's just, what are you trying to create? Are you trying to create more conflict here? Because that seems to me what you're doing. It's like, so say if your ideas really did take off, what happens to people who are of differing ideologies than yourself in your own country? If you want to view yourself as a crusader, and also, how much does that feed the the ideology of those who you're trying to defeat? I mean, ISIS runs, extremism runs on this idea that, you know, you are we're still in the Crusades, and you are fighting the Zionist crusaders in America. And, you need to defeat the Sons of Bush. I don't know if they still call them the Sons of Bush or not, but that's what I saw in the video. Um, Yeah, there's a whole narrative that's being played out, and when you play into the Islamic militants' understanding of the world, you're only going to make their attacks worse. You're only going to solidify their resolve. You know. Did everybody leave again?
Yeah, everyone was getting tired.
Yeah. It's fortunately Path. Unfortunate that Path cannot be here.
Yeah.
So, I guess with October being here, do you ever meet with or talk to the people who are celebrating Samhain?
Yeah, I help them with some of that. It's not a part of my
Yeah,
tradition. I do.
yeah. I always found that holiday to be extraordinarily interesting. Um, it's a very strange way of looking at the world. With these spirits of the dead being walking among you, and very strange to me.
Understood. A lot of um, a lot of festivals around that time in several different cultures were focused on ancestor worship or honoring the dead in some form or another. And particularly with Samhain, um, in Celtic culture and its analogs in Germanic culture, um, our modern tradition of costuming is actually rooted in an older tradition of wearing masks, particularly children wearing masks, as a means to scare off any negative spirits. And
Yep.
that reflects their idea of, well, there's the coming of winter, and a lot of ideas about various different monsters and spirits of that type, if for nothing else, can be viewed anthropologically as reflecting people's fears about the coming winter, um, as well as several other things. But some of it was also focused on the harvest and on fertility as well. Hence, some of its more taboo associations in modern culture. But it has since become more of a secular cultural holiday, and more of just something a part of American culture. And I think that it can be ultimately positive as its modern uh, counterpart, Halloween. Though it was before it was, if you're looking back far enough, um, before you're looking at Samhain, Halloween is All Hallows Eve, and November 1st is All Saints Day.
Yeah,
So there is still, at least to some degree, a liturgical Christian kind of context to it in the ways in which it's been adapted. Not as far back in the past as the Celtic holiday, to which
yeah.
it
Well,
takes a lot of its symbolism from.
yeah, it's a co-opting. I mean, both All Hallows Eve and All Saints Day are, syncretic efforts of the Catholic Church as it converted, um, you know, pagan peoples. They wanted to keep the festivals intact because people grouped around them. They just wanted to redefine them on their own terms. Um, and yeah, I found that you know very interesting to me that this the whole idea of gargoyles. I mean, it's just a syncretic part of culture that comes into Catholicism from you need to scare away the evil spirits.
And there's a lot of those sorts of things. You see reliefs and different statues in various
Mhm.
different cathedrals and churches all throughout Europe, Northern Europe, the Mediterranean, a lot of different places around the world.
Oh yeah, if you want to see a catalog of pagan cultures in Europe, all you need to do is look at what the saints are called and what the pictures are and in the churches in the areas where Catholicism took over. Um, I it's the outrage among the Protestants and the Protestant Reformation, the iconoclasm is really bred from people sort of waking up and saying, wait a second, this is pagan culture co-opted into Christianity. You know, this Saint George the Dragon Slayer is a bunch of nonsense. And we need to destroy these figurines and images of all these people that you're venerating and praying through, as you would any other pantheon of deities. It's funny. I do my small group every Monday night before I come here, and we were actually talking about, you know, different, even different like uh, Catholic, institutions where they do have, they've got all these images throughout their walls, and it's just, well, it was just like, if you're a Protestant during the period of the Reformation, you would have been taken out the axe or the sledgehammer and just it just wouldn't fly. Now Protestants love to have pictures of Jesus around them. They decorate their cars, their automobiles, and they have, even sometimes they'll get angel figurines and put them up, and um, it's becomes a consumeristic culture that would probably, the reformers at least, would have been rolling in their graves if they saw the the kinds of religious folk artifacts that people pander to each other.
Sorry, I went quiet. It's not a whole lot I have to say on the subject.
No, it's all right. It's completely different. I mean, I think that relics hold a pretty high place in your Hellenistic restoration.
Yeah, yeah. In polytheistic belief systems, they're not relics. They're icons. They're representations. There's many different ones for different reasons. Um, I mean, speaking from my perspective, I don't see it as relics. I see it as holdovers from the cultures of peoples before Christianization that are much longer standing and very difficult to get rid of because they've been a part of the culture for far, far longer. Um, so I think people eventually sort of default to those things. But there again, my theological perspective is I find monotheism inconsistent. So I think that ultimately everything defaults to its core of animistic polytheism. So
What do you find inconsistent about monotheistic Christianity?
but I find monotheism as a whole to be inconsistent. The idea of monotheism is, by definition, very, very difficult. Um, and I think by definition, when you're looking at divinity, it is varied. It takes different forms, and to try to justify the position of a singular manifestation of divinity becomes harder and harder and harder to prove. Um,
Yeah, I mean, Christians don't necessarily believe in it. The that the Lord, Jews say the God is one. Yeah, we believe that, but we do believe in a Godhead. Um, that is, we maintain it as monotheistic, but we also maintain the community of the Godhead. This is actually the way that we refer to it.
mhm. But that ultimately reflects a difference in cosmology. Um, Animistic religions see things rather differently. They see things in cycles. That divinity is an emergent property, as it were, of the cosmos itself, whereas in monotheistic religions, it's a linear religion, and that God creates the world as a separate entity from self. It's not to say that polytheism is by definition pantheistic, but that it definitely has elements that are very similar, have similar characteristics to what modern pantheism would often attribute to itself.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to confuse the creator-creature distinction with, the universe certainly isn't separate from from God in the sense that, we maintain that the Godhead is infinite, and therefore, there are multiple verses in Scripture that sort of refer to every substance and everything being held together by the grace of God, the providence of God, and that without it would sort of cease to exist. It isn't um, a pantheism, but what it is it's close to it, but it isn't it. It's
No, I
you know,
wasn't saying that mono. Oh, I never mind. I get what you're saying.
yeah. I mean, the problem I think with pantheism is like, okay, well, if everything is, well, I shouldn't say pantheism. I should say modern understandings of pantheism to sort of say, you know, the tree is God, you are God, everything is God. There is, there are good things and bad things, and it ends up being something that's more akin to George Lucas and the Force, this the world soul, if you will.
it becomes a sort of impersonal monotheism. A lot of, if you look at a lot of modern pantheism, it is almost in a sense rooted in if not a secular, more of a sort of spiritual but not religious monotheism. It's like if deism is a sort of agnostic or even atheistic form of monotheism, is sort of taking from the Christian root of European culture, then pantheists are ones who go even further to that, and you see a lot of that present in things like transcendentalism, uh, things as esoteric as New Thought or even full-on theosophy and modern occultism. But the sentiments of modern pantheism is a sort of like, well, there is still God, but the God of conception is one that's different in all the ways in which we don't want God to be from Christianity. That is to say, not a personal God with personal revelation, with personal salvation, but rather a deity that's present in all things and taking in all the things of all that exists. But whereas pantheism, classically, when you're looking at a lot of ancient religions, pre-Christian religions, it was often an element of that religion, but wasn't the defining feature. And so the idea of pantheism, the very word itself is actually fairly modern when you get down to it. But most particularly the classification, the religious identity of pantheism is even more as a modern thing. That was the fact that we have people who would consider themselves pantheists, not even naturalistic pantheists, just pantheist as a religious identifier, is a very modern thing.
Oh yeah, and it prerequisites the mass communication of cultures. It's sort of a summa, of religion. It's a sum of pagan religion. It's an attempt to get at what that might be. If somehow I could stew them all together, what would I have?
Without necessarily putting in the work and effort to understand those religions.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because if you tried to do that, you'd be missing the point, though. And you'd be trying to apply Western logic to your ideas, and that's a bad thing to the pantheist. Because Western logic is actually seen as part of the problem. This idea that of either or and contradiction.
It dovetails with a sort of modern progressivist mentality, and I see it quite a lot, even within my own community. Not even just among the philosophy community. You have a number of self-declared pantheists who are sort of secular in a certain sense, or very vaguely spiritual, the sort of spiritual but not religious, agnostic, etc. ad nauseum. But you see people who would classify themselves as pantheists in the ways in which you described as a aggregate of pagan religions, very commonly within paganism. A lot of people who haven't necessarily put in the time, the effort, and the research into finding specific traditions, into doing historical study into specific cultures, or even a mixture of cultures, or perhaps more comparatively modern times like medieval folk magic and things to this effect. I mean, there's many different avenues you can take within the pagan community. But I think for some people, it's more the feelings that which it musters in them, and oftentimes the image or the feeling that they get from the identity. So they use pagan as a very generic term to describe a sort of eco-conscious pantheism in the ways in which you've described. So I see it quite often. Most of the time when I'm able to sort of confront a person on why they consider themselves just pagan, in quotation, quote unquote, it's often because they're more comfortable with the idea of just a god of nature, with undefined, without characteristic, without specific cultural trappings, without specific virtues or specific rituals. Just the idea of that.
Well, they want a god of their own making. They want something that's going to make them feel comfortable.
Well, and it's actually a point of contention that I've had, and this actually gets to something that's often difficult for me to describe to people who are not familiar with the pagan community. there is this sort of division between those who would consider themselves traditionalists and those who would consider themselves eclectic in this sense. And you've probably seen some degree of this within Christian denominations, those who are more fast and loose with Christian doctrine. It's very similar in that sense. Whereas a traditionalist will develop a structure out of historical practices. They'll take and study that and develop a practice out of that. Study enough to understand how things were practiced and cultivate practices, regular worship, prayer, all that kind of stuff, all the trappings of modern religion, and cultivate or encourage personal experiences out of those historical structures. The eclectic does it the exact opposite way. They go from their feelings about things, and then they develop generic structures around those feelings. And because they develop it around their feelings, those structures that they developed are often like pasta. They're a little firm, but not really that very firm. It's a structure built off of that. So it will constantly change and morph because, well, our feelings ultimately change. And traditionalists will take to the feelings that drive them in a direction towards something specific. That will be used as the fire to build the kiln to make the fire for the tradition, whereas for a lot of eclectics, it's just the fire itself. It's just the raw experience. So my experience with those people, and many of us have often been in this position as younger people, that doesn't last. They end up being 10 or 15 years down the line and like, well, I really didn't cultivate anything. I really don't have a better understanding of these histories that pertain to what I'm doing. So, and I'm seeing it more and more, particularly now that people have access to collegiate level information on a lot of these subjects more often than they did even 5 years ago, more or less 10 or 15. The gravitation in my community is to move towards some kind of specific tradition, whether that tradition is old, pre-modern, or modern, to have some kind of structure where there's other people who are working towards the same goal. Is really at some point really the sign of maturity and belief. So you have a position that you can hold to. So when people ask you questions, you have something solid and concrete to reference, not just your scribblings in your notepad from when you were 15.
Yeah. Yeah, I was posting a Bible verse on my Facebook. It said, "Let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism and worship of angels, going on in detail about visions, puffed up without reason by his sensuous mind." You know, and I think that describes so many folks who do practice, you know, this real, you know, fluffy religion that is all based on the experience itself, not any historical root or sound doctrine behind them. And I think it leads people down some pretty scary alleys.
And that's not to say that even using the example you've just demonstrated that there is no validity within that. It's just the kinds of people who typically ascribe to that, they're right on the surface. To use a sort of an angelic worship as an example, if you go far back enough to Hermeticism and early Christianity, Gnosticism, a lot of the fringe elements that existed in the Hellenistic period, you can find examples of this. And within modern occultism, that's where they've taken their root. But to just be generically Christian and to worship angels, that's really half-assed. Because there's nothing within that really references any of that. If a person really was to develop a sort of faith around that, they would have to do a lot more work and have to do a lot more research to find something that would be consistent, and it would be something very, very different. It would be basically an entirely different religion.
Yeah, and I have a friend. I have a friend who's doing just that. I mean, he has a whole book on different angels, what their names are, what they do, different demonic angels, what their names are, and what they do. And he's constantly trying to figure out, okay, which ones are doing what and at what time, and it's just a whole bunch of nonsense. But what was ironic to me is what he said is it's completely legitimate if you're practicing some sort of early form of Christian mysticism. And it's ironic because that's exactly what Colossians is written against, is these early groups that were practicing angel worship, and they were doing it
Absolutely.
rather authentically in their own right. And it's just, it's building up this distinction between what is apostolic doctrine and what is this folk religion that's sort of being brought up from folk Judaism and sort of grafted in with these new Christian ideas.
But when you really get down to it, all boils all of these sort of folk beliefs, these syncretic folk beliefs. It's basically some form of Hermeticism. I mean, all of them were doing something very, very similar. Late Neoplatonism was very, very similar in the things that it attributed to itself. Hermeticism was doing very, very similar thing, and a lot of the foreign mysteries were doing very, very similar things. Theurgia and sort of God work. It's a high magic, as people would use in modern terminology, but they are, though, taking elements from, in a similar sense to how Gnosticism does, and you could very loosely use the term esoteric Christian or Gnostic Christian, but at the end of the day, it's a different religion. And I've made mention of this. We've talked about this before. As much as I would have a bias towards Gnosticism because of its similarities to what I do. I can recognize, academically, that Gnosticism and Christianity, apostolic, Orthodox Christianity, are different. They are different religions. They're basically different religions in the same way that, you could say that Sufism is based in Islam, but is very different than say, a form of Orthodox Sunni Islam would be. Though there are certain ways in which the comparison is not quite as adequate, but there are different religions and different sects of different religions, fringe religions, heretical religions, for a reason, because there are fundamental differences in doctrines that necessitate that separation.
Yep.
And that's what it comes down to when you see these people just kind of lobbing into these ideas that are very, very topical. It's at some point intellectually and academically dishonest. You're more than welcome to, and there are, and like I've said, I've looked into many different alternative religions. There are alternative religions that incorporate elements of Christianity that you would look at and you're like, what the fuck did I just read?
No, I know.
There's some really, really weird stuff. And conversely, I've seen some stuff that incorporates, some form of quote unquote Hellenism that's like, what the fuck did I just read? Trust me, I've seen a number on all sides of it, and I'm sure there's a lot of appropriation of other cultures. To those playing the home game, look up the term plastic shaman. Yeah, the West has fucked up a lot of things, unfortunately. Not to say that it's always the case in the Western bias. We were mentioning that before with pantheism, but there is a bunch of hokey, like first world problem style versions of religion that's just pathetic. It makes me shake my head.
I love it.
Well, it's kind of like I've said before, even though there's differences of opinions between, those who practice modern world religions in the West, particularly of, Christianity versus, paganism, basically what I do. I think there's a lot to be said for a level of compromise, and in the ways in which you've had issues with people doing things that you would not consider to be doctrinally consistent with even a generalized Christianity, more or less the form that you practice. I've also been the kind of person who's tried to encourage some degree of, and I hate to use the word authenticity, but more veracity of claim, more consistency and tangibility on ways in which pagan religions are defined. And I also lean more towards reconstructed forms of paganism because they are consistent to specific cultures, which I think is really the whole point. But being respectful, being well educated, well studied, being clear in one's intent, and ultimately trying to bring back religions that did value ethics, they did value virtues and piousness, devotion, religious mindsets. These are all things that are universal throughout culture, and there's been a number of quote unquote pagan religions that perpetuated a lot of negative stereotypes that had been levied against paganism. And there are people that are still feeding into this nonsense and just denigrating the pagan community, making us to be even less credible to outsiders and less trustworthy to outsiders, and that is not helping us. If we're ever going to be to a point when I'm 55, 60, 70 years old, be an elder of my community, I'd like to see that we be able to move past that and that we'll be considered credible, even though we'll still be in the very distant minority within the world. At least we'll have some degree of credibility within academia and be viewed as legitimate religions. But I think, speaking honestly, we have quite a bit of ways to go before we get to that point.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's certain things that I've really come to appreciate about specifically Hellenistic traditions. And I mean, the early, even the apostles did as well. In fact, they co-opted a lot of language. That word arete, I mean, Paul uses. He sort of co-opts the idea from, early Greek tradition and adds it to his own vocabulary and gives it a new definition. Um, and uh, in a society where we are radically postmodern and concrete ideas like arte tend to disappear, I think that I can appreciate the striving to sort of bring back those concrete ideas through those means. However, also believe in the truth of my tradition. Fortunately, the truth of my tradition doesn't allow for the truth of yours, and vice versa. So.
Well, I mean, I'd say to a certain extent, you're correct in the assertion that there is a opposition between our traditions, because mine is more flexible in its views of mythology and views of the world, and it would have been a fairly consistent view within polytheistic cultures to see a level of overlap in different belief systems that a Greek could have seen his gods as existing, while his Egyptian friend, her gods may have also existed in some form or another. And there's many different philosophies on that have been adopted into modern Reconstructionist polytheism and modern paganism. And that itself is an hour conversation, I tell you. But um, and many polytheists would probably believe, to a certain extent, that the entities within your religion would also exist in some form or another, if not attributed to something else, would exist as their own pantheon. There are those who would just say that they completely do not exist at all. But by and large, most of the people I've interacted with, myself included, would ultimately just find them to be attributions to something already pre-existent in pagan religion. That an argument that's often been made is that the figure of Christ would have been like Dionysus or Serapis or some other very similar deity, Mithras, perhaps Sol Invictus. There's a number of different deities, and I'm not taking this to the sort of crazy tinfoil hat wearing that Jesus is just a copy of this, that, or whatever. But it's more to say that when you're looking at a completely different worldview to another completely different worldview, that was a common thing in cultures. They would say, "Oh, that Horus over there is kind of like Apollo over here, and
Yeah,
this over there is kind of like
yeah.
Apollo."
No, there's certain similarities between a lot of the mystery religions that developed around Isis and Mithras and the story of Jesus, no doubt.
Sure.
Um, there's
But that being said, the idea of an ultimate salvation and the
yeah,
necessity and that there has to be a specific line to salvation through a very specific belief system from a very specific culture that developed in a very specific area would to of most other cultures in the world to have seemed completely inconsistent, and they would have collapsed. Hence why it took so long for most of Europe to convert. But what's done is done. We live in the modern age, and we have certain rights afforded to us living in modern free societies, in democratic societies. And I think that there's no inconsistency in at least respecting the boundaries of an individual. And the vast majority of Christians that I've interacted with over the years have respected, often without any explanation, past the point of I'm not Christian and I'm not looking to hear anything else on Christianity. They are willing to completely draw that line and not broach it again. The few exceptions to that rule have been family members who are overzealous, and there's only been a handful, or the street preacher, or this, that, or whatever, somebody trying to sell me something, or somebody who's probably in a bad space to begin with, and you could probably even see if you looked at them, are probably not even preaching their own religion they claim to be a part of in the first place. But most of the time, most people are completely fine with leaving people to their own beliefs and their own devices.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're expressing expresses the sentiment of a lot of people. You know, I I think that you know, Penn Jillette's pretty right when he says, hey, if you actually do believe that Jesus is the only way to salvation, how much do you have to hate me to not tell me about him? And to be honest, you know, I do believe that, I spend a lot of my time praying for those who I know who are unsaved, and trying to find ways and avenues to speak with them in a way that the gospel will sound or feel appealing to them in some way. And I have no problem sponsoring people to go overseas to Muslim countries to convert Muslims, or to go to Europe to preach to secular folks in Europe. Um, and I think that is all well and good, because I think in this marketplace of ideas, not all ideas are created equal. And if you don't fight for the ones that are correct, you're going to watch everybody sort of hop on the bandwagon of whatever's popular. And unfortunately, that's what we've watched over these last few years, and it has not been good.